Hey, I'm Sebastian and welcome to my talk for TED Summit Asia 2020 on Programmable Telecoms and what's in it for telcos. Very briefly about myself. I've been in telecoms for around 15 years. Started with 10 years work in Slovak Telecom in the area of core network design and innovation. That's also when I've attended my first TED Summit and TED Tech in 2014. And since then, I'm kind of part of the journey. I've worked afterwards for a startup from Deutsche Telekom called Immer as a head of engineering. And when Immer has been shut down, this is also something I've spoken about here. I've joined Deutsche Telekom in the wholesale network infrastructure unit, and I'm responsible there as an architect for innovation and for communication services overall. And today I want to talk a bit about the role of CPaaS for telecoms, how it compares to classic CPaaS providers, and in the end, of course, also have a look specifically at Asia and what it means to the market. Now let's get started with comparing a classical CPaaS provider, the biggest one by its definition, Twilio, with Deutsche Telekom. And looking at the numbers of Twilio, it's quite amazing to see their journey. We're looking here at the numbers from 18 and until Q3 19 for the EMEA event. I'll update this view a bit. And what we see is that they actually growth everywhere. We see the revenues grew in 18 to 650 million. They overachieved that already in the Q3 from 19. And in 2019 overall, we have seen €1 billion in revenue, which is pretty amazing considering Twilio was only around roughly 3,000 employees and had 172,000 customers in 2019. Comparing that with 2018, again, we see here a massive growth. However, if we compare that to classic telco like DT, we see big differences. So I've put here DT on the left side, and to make it more comparable, since DT let's say refers to the numbers in billion, I've made, let's say, million out of it, and it's actually pretty amazing to compare because DT's revenue grew also, but it grew 75,700 million euro in 18, while Twilio's grew only 650 million. And DT was also very profitable with 2.2 billion euro, while Twilio was not profitable at all in 2018. They spent a lot of money on marketing, and their revenues are by far not covering the acquisition costs they actually have. Now DT has many more employees, around 216,000, and however very similar, a bit less, but still a very high contribution per employee of their revenue they make. They invest a lot. They invest double-digit billion euro amounts worldwide, build a lot of infrastructure, build services, and are besides building just software and providing access and features, of course, also very active in providing access to the network. Now, one thing we see in these numbers, even though they might show that we compare apples and oranges, we see that we talk about two entirely different companies with different profiles. However, I think it's something in the scope of CPaaS that is comparable, and the kind of proof for me, or the conclusion for that, was looking at numbers that are relevant actually for the work I do. As I said earlier, I work for the wholesale unit, and if we compare here the 2018 numbers that were outlined in the DT company report for 2018, we see one line here, revenue from fixed network. And this is 673 million euro, and the report states that those are the figures that were mainly generated through wholesale services for international carriers. So that means actually the international voice platform that DT builds, where carriers can connect to other carriers and terminate their calls, and by routing, global routing, something that's actually pretty comparable to the revenues that Twilio makes. So Twilio for us is actually a relevant competitor, and it helps a bit to set the context we talk about. So we're not talking about Twilio as a very small competitor of DT's overall view, but we're talking about looking at it from voice revenue perspective for carrier interconnect. What I think is relevant in this discussion from a telecoms point of view is, of course, comparing two aspects of telecom service production. One thing is looking at the classic legacy telco communication service production, which is still a classic network technology business that is supported by IT, but how you look at it is usually NT technology is what you build and NT technology is what you operate. It's a very local business supported by inter-carrier production, but it's mostly local per country. You support and you connect the companies and consumers in your respective markets. It's a very close community, the carrier world overall. So telcos own the number space. You have a hard time porting numbers to any company that does not identify in its heart as a telco. It's regulated for a long time. You need agreements if you want to enter it, even for modern, so-called modern services like RCS. It's very dependent on the multiplayer ecosystem driven by standards. So the standardization aspects of interconnection and also the resources you can put in standardization is something that differentiates carriers from many other companies that want to innovate in this area. And last but not least, the telco service production is more or less still physical, even though it's not always a cable that leads to your home anymore and carries the voice signal. It's now digitized for many years, but it's still a physical business in fixed access because there's a cable still, as well as mobile, because in the mobile phone you also usually still have a SIM card in it and only slowly get an eSIM provision, but even then it's still bound to SIM cards. Even though it's not physical anymore, it's still an item that you provision in your phone and that is not usable like your email address would be. If you look at modern alternative communication service providers, so companies such as Twilio, but I'm also talking here about WhatsApp, Viber, many other modern companies, they're completely different. They develop mostly as an app economy play. So they need to provide good services. They need to rank high in the app stores. There are usually many alternatives in the market. They are global. So there's competition coming from all over the world, not only in your market. It's also very, very, there's also very little regulation. It's getting more, but it's still, especially for those that do not provide outbound communication, so that do not connect to the legacy telco world, it's still very little. It's also walled gardens. So while I mentioned the negative aspects of carrier interconnect being standards driven, of course it's a good thing, because once you've agreed and once you've run through this tedious process of creating and agreeing to standards, you have them and you can use them to interconnect and classic services that you do not use standardized protocols have a much harder time here. Of course, we also need to understand on the other hand that most of these services do not really require an interconnect because they get more and more into contextual communications. You can add WebRTC into any application out there. But if we talk about standalone services that are only providing communications and are not yet at the platform level, it is still true to some extent that they're walled gardens, and that's a not always positive thing. There are also very few external dependencies, since the providers provide both the application on the client's device as well as the server side, so they can use whatever protocol they want in between. Again, for a telco to provide a service to a large customer base, they still fall back on pre-installed firmware on the phones, which requires a much higher alignment. And last but not least, it's entirely virtual, enabled by software, connectivity, and the cloud. So it's not the world of modern communication service providers. It's not really physical, but it's a virtual world. Now that we've looked at telecoms and modern communication service providers, the question is, where does CPaaS fit and why did we talk about it? And I think CPaaS fits somewhat right in between. So on one hand, CPaaS is an API enabler that runs on top of telco assets. So whatever features telcos have, such as voice and SMS termination, as well as numbers, are exposed in a very modern way and easily consumable over CPaaS APIs. On the other hand, the paradigms CPaaS companies are using are much closer to those of modern communication service providers. So you see a cloud-based production, you see looking at them mostly in the global market. Of course, there are some like Twilio that are very US focused, but overall it's a global market that they're looking at. And one thing that I find very interesting, and we'll come to that later, is that it's not only the way the assets are exposed that are modern, but also the entire tool chain behind it, so the entire IT stack. So when looking at carriers, you usually have the NT stack that does all the provide, let's say, the service, and you have the IT stack that's supporting OSS BSS stack. And these supporting systems are also much faster. You get provision much faster, you get your bill much faster. When you can just add a credit card online and get billed on that. For CPaaS companies, that's much more complicated and difficult for carriers. And last but not least, the consumers are very modern and they know to choose. They know they have many choices to use. They will not always use the cheapest one. They will use the most convenient one. They will add the one that is the best in their respective region. If they're active in multiple regions, they might choose different CPaaS providers per region. So it's modern customers. It's not just those customers that take the best one or have the selection of one or two local providers of communication services. What is also very interesting is that standards are not that relevant looking at the exposed layer. Of course, they're relevant to integrate with the carrier, but actually exposing API to the customers of CPaaS company, it's done by each CPaaS company in a different way. What we see is that the TWIML standard, so the markup language that Twilio uses, is somewhat adapted by some companies. But that still happens more through something I would call reverse standardization. So the best practice will win, a bit like the AWS API is working, and not really by companies gathering and agreeing on it, right? And that, of course, supports faster innovation quite a bit. Telcos and CPaaS player both need to comply to local regulations. I mentioned it earlier, while classic communication service providers that have numbers and CPaaS elements also need to adhere to that. For CPaaS companies, it has become much stricter. So you will, if you want to have a German mobile phone number, for example, have to go through the same process you would have to go through with classic carriers. So you would need to identify yourself, send your proof of residence, go through this facial recognition, or have a short chat with an agent that verifies you with your ID card, and in the end you're verified. Still, while this process as such takes the same for telco and a bank as it does for a CPaaS provider, you will see that in the end the process that is attached to it, so getting actual access provisioned, is again much faster at CPaaS company. And last but not least, the value creation, and we'll also look at that later, for CPaaS provider is in the API abstraction and use cases, and less in volume. So for telcos, when we sell minutes on our platforms, for example, it's very much volume driven. It's price driven and volume driven, of course, but the volume generates the actual revenue. But for CPaaS providers, if you have a very good idea to abstract the problem and sell this, even if you're expensive, you might be chosen over another competitor who's cheaper simply because the solution is not as good. Looking at this pricing, what I just mentioned, what we see here is the uplift that both Nexmo and Twilio were charging for SMS and voice minutes, and we see here a simple SMS compared to average pricing you would get in Germany for terminating an SMS and for making a phone call. Here on the left side, with Nexmo, for sending an SMS is around a third more expensive than going with a classic carrier. If you want to add two-factor authentication, add another third on top, so you would pay 10 cents for an SMS that you would usually be able to buy for around 5, just because you add two-factor authentication on top of it. So a small piece of software actually doubles the revenue. Similar for Twilio. If you look here, the Twilio SMS is even more expensive than Nexmo, and for verification, Twilio adds around 5 cents, or adds actually 5 cents on each SMS. That gets even more interesting looking at phone numbers, telephony, so making a call, where you would pay around 2 cents for with a classic carrier for terminating. Here for Nexmo you would pay around 6 cents, which is 3 times as much. and Twilio similar. So you see here already, you provide the same thing, you provide termination, Twilio terminates via a carrier there, going directly to that carrier is cheaper. Nevertheless, Twilio has a big business here also in termination, simply because it's easier to consume, it's easier to configure, and it's more convenient. Last but not least, Twilio also monetizes something that carriers very often refer to OTT, so over the top, not using their network technology. While the name doesn't really make sense, it shows that Twilio actually does something that carriers were not able to, even though they've spotted the problem quite a while ago, and that is monetizing convenience. So what Twilio does for VoIP, for classic WebRTC, is they connect calls, they handle the signaling. They're essentially a signaling provider for a media engine that is provided for free in browsers and mobile phones. And for that task of connecting parties, they charge 0.4 cent per minute, which is actually an uplift from 0 to 100%. So carriers do not offer this. And even if you go peer-to-peer and there is no further media conversion with a turn server or something, you still pay a fee to Twilio for the added convenience. And I find this quite interesting because it shows that the margins and the potential for carriers here is actually not in what they provide in a price war on minutes. They actually have high quality. We offer very high quality in DT, but adding a very few elements a classic CPaaS provider has can actually allow us to monetize these minutes that we sell and this high quality trunks and connections even more. So the question is, and I already indicated what I think of it, is CPaaS now really a curse or blessing for carriers all around the world? And looking at some statistics, I think it shows already the potential that analysts see, and as also I believe in, because the forecast is actually supposed to grow very, very much from 2 to close to 11 billion between 17 and 22. We see already since we're in 2020 now, that there is a significant growth, seeing is a high demand. I think especially in small and medium-sized enterprises, the digitalization processes are now growing more than ever, so to speak. So the demand for digitalization, or what is usually referred to it, since I think digitalization itself has already happened a long time ago, but actually using new technologies for optimizing business processes and using a modern tool chain also internally in processes, not only towards your customer, will be something that is very significant in the next couple of years. And of course, communications features to reach out to your customers, to your employees, is a very significant part of that. And these features are provided and can be consumed from CPaaS providers. Carriers are slowly started with CPaaS. We'll see that in the next slide. There are a couple of prominent examples. I think it's really something some carriers have already understood. I have to also say there were initiatives in the past, also from DT, that were less successful, but they were a bit before that time and they maybe didn't have the correct approach. I think what we see now executed in the US and in Europe is something that is can be a role model for other carriers and only highlights, let's say, the potential by directly offering CPaaS features. It does not even highlight the potential one would have going beyond that and cooperate on top of that. Last but not least, also the market capitalization grew from 3 to around 20 billion, comparing mid-17 to mid-19 of Twilio. That's also a metric. While I cannot really judge the height of it, whether or not it's true, but what is clearly visible is the growth we're seeing by the number going from 3 to 19. I think the next point I want to go into is getting started with CPaaS for many carriers, and I think it's something that actually fits most telco strategies, since the lower cost and faster time to market is something that is interesting for the product innovation part in carriers. So most of the marketing people actually want to get their costs down and they want to be faster to innovate in front of their customer, and CPaaS would allow them to do exactly that, being an internal customer also for their main communications features. You have anyways currently in the industry evolutions towards APIs and automation, so it supports also technology strategy. While classic, let's say the classic NT view on rebuilding the stack may be a bit different than a CPaaS provider would do it, it is still something that fits the overall strategy. And in the end, it's also a chance, as I mentioned already, for new business and cooperation models between carriers, between marketplaces, between companies sitting on top of these assets or using these APIs to simply bring capabilities into single carriers, but also carrier groups, markets amongst different carriers, and also a wider range with some forms of alliances. So this is, I think, very strong argument. So on one hand, we have innovation and product side, technology side, but also the overall picture of telecoms ecosystem that's actually benefiting from it. What we see is that other CPaaS providers capture a lot of values on top of telcos, and I think it's time for telcos to get it back. Of course, what we need to think of as carriers is whether we can do it better than those companies, since a classic CPaaS provider still bring us access, and so they bring us access in terms of using our termination, and of course, if they bring us a lot of traffic. And we are not able to capture as much traffic, we need to see if it makes economically sense to compete with them and maybe get less traffic, but be able to charge higher and develop our own product. So it's something carriers need to think of, but I think the positive view here is much more significant than the risks. And last but not least, I think CPaaS is evolving, and I've touched this earlier, looking at telcos and communication service providers and their IT stack and their way to provision customers. I think really what CPaaS is evolving to is somewhat the telecommunication support system of many applications and services for carriers, but also for their users. And it makes the role of telcos themselves less relevant. And this is something I want to dive in the second part of my presentation, looking at the telecommunication support subsystem. When we look about CPaaS and the telecommunications support system, I think it's important to highlight that telephony and SMS are not going away. These services are still there, and they are also still there to a large extent the way they were produced. So these were produced as end-to-end network technology services supported by an OSS and BSS stack that are consumed in applications and devices dedicated for this, which essentially means you have a phone, and the phone part of the phone, so the actual telephone icon, the green button if you wish, that green button communicates with a backend that provides telephony, and behind it bills are generated, your customer data is managed, and so on. This is still going to be there, but the future and actually the huge potential for carriers is in the gateway function that gives on one hand access to this legacy world and uses it, but also is able to modernize it. And because I do not think carriers are able to modernize it by themselves, I think they need to support the business processes and the requirements of companies that are able to modernize it, but are not necessarily able to manage that telco stack. So we will go from this end-to-end NT services to more business process supporting communication enablers that are produced within an IT infrastructure and paradigms, and can then be integrated anywhere. So you have a company or an internal system that manages employees or that manages customers, a CRM or an HR system. You have this IT system, you have process descriptions, you have already internal digitalization initiatives, so to use digital tooling and overall modern tool set to become more efficient in managing your business processes. And the one piece that you need for it to offer communications features is something that can be provided as one of the elements by a telecommunication support system. And this is overall a shift that I believe in, and I think it's going to be fully API driven, everything in there, the enabler of course, but also everything that is interconnected. So there will be a provisioning API, there will be a user lifecycle API, there will be a billing API, and so on. So everything will be API driven, and it will support, next to telephony and SMS, more modern technology. So you will have much faster access to newer technologies such as WebRTC, offering also video, offering also new ways of handling signaling and data transfer between devices and so on. So all of that will become part of it. And that's actually no surprise, because that's also what we've seen with CPaaS providers. They offered initially only communications features and grew the feature set that they offer to their customers by their demands. So you have now in Twilio, for example, a queuing, you have SMS in there, but you have also the possibility of directly add serverless functionality and so on. And I think the question is now, how can the TSS paradigm help? I think it can help quite a lot for carriers at how they look at their world, and also for the internal transformation, because telecoms can now act for any type of service as enabler, and especially the TSS or the CPaaS part can act as an enabler. And this is very relevant because it makes carriers move away from also their thought model, which was in the past very network centric, and should become more customer centric and much more integrated in the IT tool chain. And I think while network organizations are trying to get there, they are still network organizations, and I do not believe that they fully manage to shift themselves. They're always runner-ups from the IT world, and this is why I think looking at CPaaS on top of the classic telco enabler stack, you have a good way to actually enable, as I mentioned earlier, product and technology, mitigate the investment risk, and actually bring NT and IT closer together, and make IT less of a cost factor. I've tried to showcase this here. So what we see on the right side is IT as a small attachment of NT. This is kind of, in my opinion, the legacy view. Where we're getting at and where we already are is that they are more or less equal. Of course, they are not equal in carriers. Why do I say that? Well, there is still the thought of IT as something besides something like T-business, so not the classic integration business, but for a classic telco that provides communication services, IT is still just the supporting element, and NT is the new thing. And of course, the NT teams build modern communication stacks. They use virtualization technologies. We do the same. They use a better way to deploy appliances on top of that than they used to in the past. They work differently together with their vendors, but nevertheless, they are not yet at a level where the IT is. And what I believe in, and as I said, will be more shift to the right side here, where we have the user experience in focus for the carrier, either directly, but more often than that, indirectly, so that in the end, the user, whatever product the user has in their hands, they will get the best experience. This is mostly driven by a modern IT stack. All of the cloud-enabled companies, all of the companies that use new technologies to produce services, Airbnb and Twitter and Facebook and whoever, many others, they're mostly IT-enabled, web-enabled. And all of these companies are very good. They have very good product people. They're able to actually develop this user experience focus. And the NT technology will be a supplement to that. It will enable, especially what Telcos is good at, communication features. But it will do that in a paradigm that can be consumed easily by IT, and that is more modern. And if we think this through, carriers can also consume exposed features by themselves and actually modernize their own stack in all of this. And this is where I basically see the big potential in programmable telecoms, or in telcos becoming CPaaS providers, or in telcos adding CPaaS features. This is just a recap more or less of what I said earlier. We saw there's a lot of relative margin on top, so we can finally transition from a volume-based business to more of a value-based business. We can prevent churn, and we can acquire new business much faster, because many companies that moved from classic carriers to CPaaS providers did so because of the better consumability of features. A classic example is here, what's been presented also on previous conferences, the ING case, moving from KPN in the Netherlands to Twilio, and now partially regretting it, because after all, carriers aren't that bad, but they are not there yet. So ING will still stay with Twilio, at least last time I've attended one of the discussions there. the potential to assume a new role as communications enablers. So carriers are actually not only telcos providing communication services, but also features, make them easily consumable, have the supporting IT processes, be one of many aspects of a modern tool chain. Many companies specialize like that to be very good in a certain thing and be, let's say, enabler in a large portfolio and an orchestration of enablers, if you wish. And this is also what carriers can become. And the chance to rethink the NT-IT split is also something where I believe there's a lot of potential to optimize the internal organization and generate customer value. Because in the telco world, also from my experience, we're looking a lot for experienced developers that can build communications applications or other applications, but we're actually sometimes forgetting about the thousands of people that are employed in our IT. And if we would give them the tool set, the exposed tool set of communications enablers, I'm more than certain that those would be excellent communication service developers as well. Another potential is the ability to address new competitors in the global and local markets. So of course, if telcos become CPaaS providers, they can compete also with CPaaS providers, not just with other carriers. And if you're the local telco that offers CPaaS features while others don't, of course, it also has a differentiating element in your local markets. And once you find, you create alliances with others, of course, it's again a differentiating feature also compared to, for example, Viber and WhatsApp, because their APIs are usually much more costly and maybe not as tailored to the local markets as carriers could make it. So I think there are many questions open. I don't have an answer to all of them. So just summarize a few: make or buy. So build one yourself or buy a platform, build or partner, acquire or aggregate. And also where does the enabler and the API story start? Where does it stop? So it's also about connectivity and other things. So I think you need to get started somewhere. But for example, insourcing a CPaaS platform with one of the CPaaS vendors, just connecting the 3 lines that I outlined earlier, voice, SMS, and numbers, and you can actually get started and see where it goes. And even if you charge only a small uplift to what you would usually charge to your numbers or minutes, you will see that you're still much more price competitive or much cheaper than actually other CPaaS providers, while still offer most likely better quality in your markets than those providers do. And it's only a question of getting the word around to also see customers come. I really believe in this. And since you always, or since carriers, we do the same, since carriers not just believe that they have the best network in the market, DT actually has proven it has the best network in the market. But overall in the market that carriers are in their local markets, they are the best, and they are usually better than going over various third parties as CPaaS providers would do. And why not monetize this? There's actually nothing to regret. As I said earlier, you do not need to change a lot. Just connect it with the classic legacy interface as a CPaaS platform and you can get started. So overall, concluding on a bigger picture before we look specifically at Asia, I think this discussion is actually only special and not natural because of the special role telecoms see themselves in, or we see ourselves in, and the carrier ecosystem. If it would not be as regulated, if it would not be as standards driven, if it would not be, and so on, if there would be proper competition, if anyone could get actually port numbers or sideload their communication stack into phones, we would be already way past that. But we're not. And also NT-IT and all the history behind that is, I think, very, very specific in telcos. So that's why the discussion is different. Nevertheless, I think seeing what works in other industries and how IT, with the role of IT and how enablers can be orchestrated, is something that I really think the discussion isn't as special after all. We just think it is. Once we treat telecoms like yet another IT application, I think also for telecoms themselves, they can evolve much faster with their internal optimization processes and with thinking what is the first process, let's say, to optimize now in the internal so-called digitalization program and so on. So I think there's really a lot of potential hidden. And of course, we can also refer to what we did in the past. So when I worked in Slovakia, I was part of the fixed network part of Telecom there. We had a separate mobile company. We merged eventually. Everyone thought it's not possible to do that. Yet here we are, one integrated company, integrated networks, and so on. And I certainly believe this merger, even though it was thought impossible or not really easy, was actually smooth. People are able to talk to each other, and there are many synergies. And I think this can really serve as blueprint also for merging in a smarter way or in a smart way at all. Also the NT and the IT world, and actually leverage the capabilities there. Many new market players, I believe, that evolved in the market is something that if you combine a modern telcos IT with assets that they have below and make something out of it that's easily consumable for developers, you actually have a very big potential to differentiate in your market and be relevant. Concluding generally, I think it makes sense to look at Asia a bit and also reflect on the blog posts that were already out there. So what does it mean for Asia? Actually, IdeaMart in Sri Lanka is the most successful telco CPaaS globally. So what Axiata did there, and they've been previous years also on TED Summit, sharing their stories and ran successful TEDx, I think it shows that it can work, especially in Asia. They have very high revenue contributions in their markets. Currently the performance is a bit flat since they focus on messaging. But overall, there are success stories for telco CPaaS, and they are actually in Asia. So it's nothing where we need to rethink Western approaches for there. It can actually work there. And the keys to success actually were that they started, like I described just now, they treated messaging like yet another IT application. They needed to expose it very simply to attract developers and not to confront them with complexity. So anyone was who could, let's say, interact or write a few scripts, interact with simple APIs, was needed to use them, and they were successful with that. So they managed not just the technical implementation, but actually the abstraction, which is the complex part. As I said, they were there was interest. They could generate interest also in the community. They were the largest TED global location for many years, and also for customers. Actually, there were side effects for Axiata, because customer would also choose their telco based on whether they supported IdeaMart. In the analysis that Alan will present on the CXTech landscape, what we will see is though that even though there is one success story, Asia overall is underrepresented. So all of the big companies, Twilio, Vonage, I've mentioned earlier, there are a few others here that you can see. They are all Western companies. There are not really any champions that could move beyond Asia, or that at least gather the Asian market, let's say, sizably to be also interesting for Western companies. And we basically did not yet manage to close this multi-billion-dollar revenue gap for CPaaS in Asia. And this is something I think, especially in this community where we have people from all over the world, understanding various aspects of the ecosystem, we can think what to do there. One possibility, of course, is by Asian telcos to close this gap. If they start treating telecoms like yet another IT application, so consider themselves, that's a general telco phenomena, but also relevant, of course, for the Asian one, not to consider themselves special. Do a very simple abstraction, learn from what others did. That's very important. If you look at all the CPaaS players, many of them did start a copy from Twilio and then improve certain aspects and start to, let's say, become very special. But overall, Twilio started it all, and if not, let's say, technology-wise, at least some of the paradigms became, at least from my view, first relevant when they were initially brought forward by Twilio. And in the end, also integrate the experience and build an ecosystem. So this ecosystem, again, can be global, but since in Asia, you have, and again, this shows IdeaMart and all of the integrations. There are many players that offer already APIs. There are many platforms that were able to start with communications and then grow much bigger. And that's also a chance for Asian telcos, of course, to get started small, to get started with one exposure that you abstract, very simple, and then try to win over the hearts from the developers, but also the small, medium-sized companies to become an attractive integration partner for them. That's it from my side. Thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions or want to discuss certain things that I mentioned, please feel free to use the comments or send me an email or drop me a text, and then we can arrange even a follow-up call if you wish. Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to the remaining TED Summit material and also our planned panel session.